Hello, I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of Insight's Public Lectures. The latest lecture in our series Insights Revisited, where we look back at highlights from our past, was the Tyneside Geographical Lecture of 2013, given by Bruce Kent, who had been such an active campaigner against war and the arms race in the 20th century. He came to Newcastle to speak about preventing war in the 21st.
The Tyneside Geographical Lecture 2013. Just after midnight on September the 26th, 1983, the alarm went off inside a military bunker south of Moscow. Satellites warned that the Soviet Union was under attack from the United States. Screens indicated that 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles were heading towards Russia. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, had only minutes to act before expected impact. It was his job to initiate a counterattack before the incoming missiles destroyed Soviet silos and made that impossible. He made a gut-level decision that there was a malfunction and decided not to initiate a counter-response. And fortunately for the world, his gut-level decision was correct. The satellites had detected low-lying clouds. It sounds like a film, but it really did occur at a time of tense Soviet-US relations just after the USSR had downed a Korean airliner. Bizarrely, Petrov was disciplined for not following protocol. Our speaker this evening has dedicated his life to challenging the geopolitical logics and practices that make that type of scenario possible. Bruce Kent is a high-profile British peace campaigner. He served as an officer in the Royal Tank Regiment in the late 1940s, and after reading law, trained for the Catholic priesthood, from which he retired in 1987 to contest a seat in the general election. He served as General Secretary and Chair of CND for most of the 1980s, and was also served as President of the Nobel Prize-winning International Peace Bureau in Geneva. He's currently Vice President of CND, of Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace Organization, and of the Movement for the Abolition of War. He is preparing a scrap Trident tour to cover all parts of the UK next month. Now, undoubtedly, Bruce is a great figure of importance in UK debates about defence, but you may be wondering why we've invited him to deliver a geographical lecture. The US satirist Ambrose Bierce is credited with quipping that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Do enroll in our department for a more Pacific way of learning if you're interested. But Newcastle geography has a long tradition of scholarly engagement with the way that war and militarism remakes places and landscapes, and with challenging the way that thinking about regions and countries as being certain types of places populated by certain types of people makes war more likely. In the 1980s, for example, research in this department on the geography of a possible Soviet nuclear attack undermined and challenged the Home Office's claims that Britain could survive a nuclear war if we stored water in the bathtub and leant a door against the wall at a certain angle. And those of you who remember the 1980s will no doubt remember Protect and Survive. Now, the annual Tyneside Lecture commemorates the Tyneside Geographical Society, which was set up in 1887. We have in this marvellous visitors book a record of every speaker and their guests who have spoken since 1891. As well as academic geographers, we have a proud tradition of inviting public geographers, explorers such as Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen, writers like Mary Kingsley and Hilaire Belloc, peace campaigners like Mary Sheepshanks, the prominent 1920s feminist pacifist campaigner, and diplomats like Gertrude Bell, a local lass who drew up the boundaries of the current state of Iraq, and journalists such as Winston Churchill in his days as a reporter, and more recently, Patrick Cockburn, all of whose signatures are recorded in this book. And it's in this spirit of public geography that we are delighted to welcome Bruce this evening. I'd like to thank the university's, the Insights Public Lecture Series for accommodating our talk this evening, and also the School of Geography and Politics and Sociology. Likewise, we are grateful to the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers who co-sponsor this event as a recognition of the historic partnership between our two societies. And I would like particularly to extend a welcome to regional members of the RGS who are here this evening, as well as to members of the Northumbria and Newcastle University's Martin Luther King Peace Committee, and to all members of the public. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Bruce Kent to deliver the 2013 Tyneside Geographical Lecture entitled Eliminating War in the 21st Century.
Thank you very much. Well, Nick, thank you very much indeed. I get different versions of my obituary about twice a week, and that's quite an original one. Thank you very much. I'm sorry this university has come so far downhill, because the first lecturer in 1891 was the Duke of Northumberland, and you bump your way down slowly, and now you've got to me. Well, there we are. You'll have to put up with that. I used to be quite very well known in the 80s when C&D was in household name on every television every night. But I know that fame doesn't last, and my father used to say, make friends on the way up, because you meet them all again on the way down. Well, I've done that several times in my life, and I realized that fame fades when someone came up to me the other day and said, he looked at me for a very long time, he said, "Are you Bruce Kent?" I said, "Yeah." "Oh," he said, "I thought you were dead." I thought, it's very charming. And then on the Underground, there's actually both true stories. The Underground, someone was reading a newspaper sitting next to his wife, and I was sitting up with my wife at the other end. And you could always tell when they're peering around the newspaper to look at you. I knew something was going on. And finally, he came up to me and said, "I'm awfully sorry to have to ask you this. I wouldn't dream of doing it but for my wife's insistence. Can you tell me who you were when you were important?" So, who cares? Who cares? Who cares? I'm going to tell you, we all start a good lecture with a little story. They're called parables, got a very good precedent. A little story. When I was a youth of about 9, I was quite naughty, and my brother, who was 10, was even naughtier. And my mother and father were sort of middle-class, Golders Green sort of people, and they had various dinner parties, and a lot of preparations went on, and we could see from the banisters upstairs what was happening. Everything was being laid out, and all over downstairs there were 5 or 6 or 7 nice cigarette boxes full of cigarettes on different tables all around. So my brother and I had a very good wheeze. We got a pin out of a drawing box somewhere, and we went downstairs when no one was looking, and we punctured all the cigarettes with little holes. It's a fantastic effect, because when someone lights a cigarette that's full of holes and tries to inhale or even to draw in at all, nothing happens. The light goes out at the end. And we were sitting upstairs hooting with laughter as all these guests were wandering around trying to get a cigarette that worked. Of course, we paid for the price later in the evening when my father came upstairs. But what's the point of that story? Not the little naughty little boys. The point of that story is a middle-class family having a party in the 1930s, laid out hundreds of cigarettes all over the room, because smoking was absolutely normal, and people who didn't smoke were rather peculiar. My parents allowed me to smoke in their presence in the living room at about 16, before I was even out of school. I was smoking. That was the fashion. Now, atmosphere has completely changed. Smoking is prohibited here and there and everywhere. You've got to go outside. Some of these pubs knock down a bit of wall in order to make a bit of outside so they can have a table in the open air and all that. We had someone to dinner a little while ago, quite a posh person, editor of a national religious paper, and he was well known for his cigars. And at the end of the very nice meal, he pulled out the cigar and said, "Bruce, do you mind if I smoke?" And I said, "Not at all, Otto. I'll show you where the garden is." And he was good-humoured, but his wife was a bit miffed about that. The point I'm making is that smoking, which was absolutely de rigueur, has completely changed. It's now outside. Why? How has it happened? in less than 60 years or so, the attitudes to smoking has completely changed. The point is that public attitudes to everything can change for the good or for the ill, depending on what position you're in, but they can and they do change. We've all got the stuff from Parliament about how impossible it would be to have women having the vote. It would be a complete disaster around the world if that happened, etc., etc. Now, anybody saying that, heavens above, women bishops, that's put the Church of England offside a bit, hasn't it? And when that reaches the Vatican, I'll be utterly astonished. But nevertheless, it will come in due course, believe me. Slavery used to be a normal affair. We had to pay major British slaveholders millions of pounds when slavery was finally abolished to compensate them for their different estates in the West Indies. Changes in public attitude. And I think exactly the same applies to peace and war. Exactly the same. Attitudes can and do change. When I grew up, I love talking about myself. When I grew up, I was in the traditional British boarding school, and we had the traditional British Cadet Corps. So on Mondays and Tuesdays, this particular man would teach me French or Latin or something or other, but on Wednesday afternoons, he turned out to be a second lieutenant in the Cadet Corps, and he issued me my rifle at the age of, I suppose, 13 or 14. I was an armed schoolboy. We had major religious ceremonies and processions in the school, and preceding the Blessed Sacrament, our major object of religious attention would go a platoon of cadets with their rifles fixed in front. Now, Jesus must have been very amused by all that, I'm sure. We had cigarette cards. I remember my poor father didn't die of lung cancer. I don't know why not, because I sent him out all the time to get packages of 20 cigarettes. They had these lovely big cards in of the ships of the Royal Navy. And then you moved on to players, 20 a packet, and you got the armies of the Empire. And I remember now, wonderful little black chaps and brown chaps wearing funny helmets all over the world, all part of our wonderful, great British family. Never occurred to me that anything could have gone wrong. Remembrance Day was not like today, a bit of a passing event. Remembrance Day was taken very seriously. On the Sunday, or whatever day it was, always the Sunday, I think, everything in London stopped, absolutely everything, at 11 o'clock on the 11th. And cars were there, people, bicycles, pedestrians, complete silence. That's the way I was brought up. It was a kind of militarist background, which we all had. That's moved on a long way. A lot of people think in very different terms, even though I think the government now is doing its very best to re-inculcate a climate of cultural militarism in so many different ways, especially in schools and in education. I don't think there's anything peculiar about suggesting that war is not a very intelligent way of solving conflicts. It's exactly what we said when we signed the Charter of the United Nations, the preamble to the Charter. We're there to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Well, in domestic life, we wouldn't think, most of us, very few people would ever think of solving their conflicts by violently assaulting somebody else. It did happen in history. It happened quite often in history. Even in the 19th, 18th century, people went around London with servants with flaming torches and carrying swords. Somehow or other, that has disappeared. Culture and the structures of non-violent resolution of things have changed attitudes enormously. I live in a little street in North London. We must have about 40 houses, I suppose. Each house is 2 flats, and on my one side there's Italians, and the other side there's someone from Guyana, there's Poles, there's some Irish families, West Indians, etc., etc. A whole mix. Anybody who knows North London, Kurds, Turks, Greeks, etc., etc. Well, we don't all like each other. I get on with quite a lot of them quite well. We're all more or less in neighbourhood watch. Some people I really quite dislike. The man who parks his car in the bit of road that I consider to be my bit of road makes me very angry indeed. He doesn't seem to realise that I have a privileged position there, which I haven't, but I think I have. The woman who plays loud music on a hot summer's afternoon with her window open, well, that's very aggravating. I've never thought of going down to home base and buying a hand grenade and chucking it through the window. It wouldn't really occur, because A, home base would lock me up immediately and call the police if I asked for a hand grenade. The whole structure of things has changed. Why? Why is it on our little street that we manage, all these nationalities, manage some kind of civilized, non-violent way of getting on together? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, though it's not an affluent part of London, believe me, there's no millionaires on our street, nobody is actually starving. Nobody. There's adequate provision. It may not be enough, it certainly isn't. And some people are up against the wall, especially these days, with all the cuts, but nevertheless, nobody is starving. So the economic system is not building a team of slaves or deprived people who would legitimately perhaps feel that violence was their only solution. Furthermore, you can do what you like in terms of religion or politics as long as you're not a public nuisance. If you want to have a ceremony in your front room and sing hymns, well, you can do it as much as you like, as long as you don't really disturb everybody next door. If you want to stand as a member of the council, Haringey Council, you can stand up, you can write a letter to the local paper, you can express yourself, more or less. That's not true internationally. Many countries where you can't express yourself internationally, where people do not have the same rights as other people, and where the scourge of poverty is a real terrible burden for all sorts of people. While we argue about bankers not getting £1 million bonuses, other people are wondering where they're going to get £5 for to feed the family for the next 2 weeks. But in our street, we've achieved something. And I think in the world at large, if you think I'm going to go on forever, I'm not. I was told in the army, when I was in the army, if you talk for more than half an hour, well, after 15 minutes, half the troops will be asleep. If you talk for more than half an hour, all will be asleep. So I'm watching carefully to see anybody nodding off. I hope not. We've changed things in many structures that make war. The European vision is astonishing. I'm really amazed how little credit is given to what has happened in Europe since 1945. The people of Monet and those who set up the European Union set it up precisely so that the Germans and the French and the British and perhaps the Italians would not go to war again. That was the idea. It was right back to middle of the 19th century. The same sort of vision came up, and it's operated. We aren't going to have a war in Europe. The Germans and the French may not love each other, but they are now so interlocked economically and politically and even militarily that they couldn't do it. It wouldn't make no sense at all. So we moved a bit. The Norwegians and the Swedes used to have regular wars till about 1906, I think, or 1908, when they agreed some sort of truce and so on, an inter-political arrangement, and war went out the window. It's impossible. I remember once going to Erie, Pennsylvania, and coming across a great monument to our victory over the British. I looked at this, Erie, Pennsylvania, where on earth they have a victory over the British? Of course it was the 1812, was it, 1814 war, the British against the new American states, and it all took place on Lake Erie and up there. It's incredible now, quite impossible. Then 1812 was the war with Canada. Impossible to consider a war on that continent. So there are steps of progress. We've changed a bit of the culture. We've changed some of the structures, I think, that make it difficult to have war. When you think of the changes that have happened, we just accept them without realizing how they've happened. In North London, this is part of the culture of peace. In North London, in Hampstead Cemetery, there is a grave which is covered in blackberry bushes. Very nice blackberries, and underneath it is the name of the first British Nobel Peace Prize winner. Anybody know who the first British Nobel Peace Prize winner was? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. If he'd been a general, he'd have had a horse and there'd be no blackberries. But he's there under the back. His name is Randall Kramer. He was a Labour member of Parliament out of the emergent Labour, and he devoted his life to building ideas of arbitration between countries. And I think that what he was doing found expression in something else nobody knows about, and that is Tsar Nicholas II's peace conference of 1899 in The Hague, where arbitration was brought up, and there we did our best to knock it, as we knocked the 1932 League of Nations disarmament conference by sending to this dream of Nicholas II to have a great peace conference. We sent Admiral Fisher. Anybody remember Admiral Fisher? Admiral Fisher was the man whose slogan was, "We want 8, we won't wait." And the 8 were battleships. So we want to get 8 battleships before the Germans could. Now, in its wisdom and pacific intentions, the British government of the day sent Fisher to be our representative at an international peace conference. Well, ha ha. But out of that conference did come the seeds of what has become the International Court of Justice, carried on through the League of Nations, and became part of the UN structure. All because a few people, not many, a few people like Randall Kramer pushed for arbitration. An important and very important step forward. We have now, I opened the other day, a report of the Hague Peace Conference, a non-governmental affair, which took place in 1999, a centenary event. It's quite a thick booklet, and I opened it. Dreams for the future. Number 1, the establishment of an international criminal court. Well, we have an international criminal court. It's not perfect, far from it, but we have one now, and it's there. And this is since the 1999 conference. And how did that happen? Because a few people were sufficiently bothered to want to do something about it. It's there. I hope that its jurisdiction will very considerably expand in the near future, and that it will do so. So we have, I think, a lot of progress, but an awful lot of ignorance. Awful lot of ignorance. We have now on nuclear weapons, we've got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Up in Scotland the other day, in the Scotland on Sunday, the government is reported to have said that Scotland, if it becomes independent, will not be legally entitled to have nuclear weapons. Well, I don't think the Scots are dying to have nuclear weapons anyway, so that won't bother them too much. But it implied, and it more than implied, it said that some countries are legally entitled to have nuclear weapons. That's from Her Majesty's government. Completely untrue. No country is legally entitled to have nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, all it said was those who have nuclear weapons in 1968 must not share that knowledge with anybody else, and that they must, Article 6, they must do their best to negotiate the abolition and elimination of all nuclear weapons. Now, it doesn't an entitlement, but now it's become a kind of entitlement. People don't know what's going on. Nobody knows that one of the wonderful misuses of the UN structure, the veto can be got round. There was an attempt to get the International Court of Justice to give an advisory opinion on the legality and use of nuclear weapons. Well, we were blocked by the veto. So we got hold of a little Pacific island country called Vanuatu. Never heard of it? No, I hadn't before. And in Vanuatu, there's a wonderful woman who was the health minister. And she said, well, I'll get the World Health Organization to ask for an advisory opinion. Oh, shock, horror. The World Health Organization, the Americans, or nobody else, has a veto. There are no vetoes on the subsidiary organs of the UN. So the World Health Organization took a vote and agreed to ask for the advisory opinion. The Americans and the British were furious. They said nuclear weapons are not a health issue. Well, I don't know what they thought it would be, but anyway, they tried to obstruct that particular, but they didn't succeed. The advisory opinion came out very strongly on our side, in fact, but even more importantly than the use or non-use was what they added was that everybody has a legal obligation to negotiate the abolition of nuclear weapons and to bring those negotiations to a successful conclusion. Yeah, but nobody knows about it. So I think the culture is changing, the structures are changing, but we have an awful lot of cultural problems in the way that we've got to deal with. How many times at public meetings has someone said at the back, what about Hitler? I was in Durham the other day and I said it'd be interesting if someone asked me what about Hitler, and immediately someone said, what about Hitler? Because of course Hitler is meant to be a knockout blow. I said, well, it's not about Hitler in 1939, it's about Hitler in 1933 that we ought to be concerned about. Hitler came as a minority power, minority party at that time, and we all knew what he was about. It's all in Mein Kampf and other documents, his racism and everything else. And who was the first international authority to recognize Hitler? It was the Vatican, followed by all other countries as well. Come to the 1932 disarmament conference, when actually had there been a strong position taken by America and Britain, we could have had some very intelligent disarmament programs under the Hoover proposals which came out. They were all laughed at. Why? Because we were not going to have a navy shorter and smaller than the United States Navy. Basically, that's what it came down to. You could read it all in Noel Baker's book about the 32 conference. And Hitler, of course, walked through an open door to the point that when a number of German Nazi generals came to London, or wanted to come to London, made negotiations to talk to the Foreign Office about getting rid of Hitler, our Foreign Office wouldn't talk to them. They said, we don't deal with as it were, subsidiary organs. We only deal with governments directly, so we can't deal with you. And in fact, as late as July of 1939, it's all in Hansard, there was a challenge in the House of Commons about the amount of material that we were selling to Nazi Germany up to July of 39. War material, rubber and nickel were being sold in large, 4 times as much as we'd ever sold before. And when put to the question, the Board of Trade said this is only a commercial matter, it's not a political matter. So when I say what about Hitler, it's not 1939 September, it's January of 1933 that we should have been aware and thinking about. But that myth is there. There's the great myth that nuclear weapons were the only way to end the Second World War. They ended the Second World War. The only way to end the Second World War? I think that's quite untrue. If you read a book called Racing the Enemy by a Japanese professor, you'll see the real motivation was to keep the Soviets out of the Pacific. Stalin had already moved millions across, amazingly, across that railway. He'd already occupied Manchuria, and he was coming down the islands, which are now contested. And what they wanted to be quite sure was that he would not take the Japanese mainland. And indeed, that's what the Japanese wanted. We knew, of course, before Potsdam, we knew that the sticking point with the Japanese was the position of the emperor. Because we were tapping into the codes that were going through Moscow, we knew that that's what the Japanese sticking point was. We didn't care. We had Potsdam, unconditional surrender, full stop. The moment MacArthur actually had his victory and parades and all the rest of it in Tokyo, the one thing they gave the Japanese was the position of the emperor. He was never tried as a war criminal, independent. He kept his status all the way through. We could have ended the Second World War without the barbarism of killing 200,000 innocent people with this incredible bomb which threat hangs over us all today. That's why I'm so anxious to do something about Trident, because I don't know how we can conceivably tell Iran or North Korea or anybody else that they can't have nuclear weapons when we're going to spend £100 billion to make sure that we have nuclear weapons for another 40 years. Doesn't make sense, but that's what the current situation is. Lots of things in education we could be doing. That's a wonderful little booklet. I've only got 20. They're all free. Come and grab them if you want to. It's a bit unfair on the back rows. The front rows can get them. But it's a little booklet with the ideas of Erskine Childers, who is a really marvellous man, a UN civil servant, on the reform of the UN, including all sorts of things like a People's Assembly, elected rather like our Brussels Parliament, and so on. Lots of good ideas. But in schools, I go to lots of schools, I've yet really to come across a school where anybody's ever actually even seen the UN Charter, let alone discussed it. It's not part of the syllabus in some way. It's like knowing all about the Highway Code, but knowing nothing about Parliament or the Magna Carta or any of the other things that are meant to control our country. So education is desperately important. Non-violent heroes. We all hear about heroes of violence, but there's so many non-violent heroes. When I think of, perhaps some heads will nod, if I mention Franz Jägerstätter, an astonishing man in the Second World War, an Austrian farmer who was deeply Christian, and when he was called up in 43 and was presented with the unconditional oath to Hitler, he said, I'm not taking an unconditional oath. God is my only person to have an unconditional oath. And anyway, Hitler is gobbling up Europe in a barbaric way. He had 3 daughters. He was immediately arrested in February, I think, of 43, and he was beheaded in August of 43. But what a hero. That absolute determination to say no. I think the story that Nick gave us from Petrov is very interesting. We've actually got a domestic one. I don't think he'd like to be quoted here at all. But General Jackson of Kosovo fame, do you remember General Jackson leading the armies up? Well, he was told by the American commander, he was told to move his paratroopers up to Pristina airport and capture the airport before the Russian troops came down. And they were beetling down through Serbia to get to Pristina first. And Jackson said to the American, I won't accept that order. I'm not starting World War III for you. Well, bully for him. But the number of times that the military have actually refused orders is very limited indeed. When I was in the army, no one ever suggested to me there might be a time when I might have to feel that I had to say no to something. Never at all. We were given how am I doing now? Another 5 minutes. We were given the most clinical instructions about how to clear a rioting crowd. Well, in Golders Green, we didn't have many rioting crowds, so I didn't know what the situation would be. But anyway, it was quite simple instructions, and I could see that it probably operates in various countries under the British rule at the time. And that was, you go to the town square where all these horrible people are rioting, and you make sure that all the exits to the square are clear, and you number off your riflemen so their names aren't going to be known, and with a loud hailer you say, I'm giving you 10 minutes to clear the square, and I'll give you a warning after 5 minutes, and if you don't clear the square, then you, the young officer, will tell Rifleman 1, shoot the man in the red jumper hanging on the lamppost. You do, of course, because it's an order. And then you wait a few minutes, they don't move, you say, well, shoot the other one with the hat on over on the other side. That was the kind of spirit of clinical obedience that we were being trained for. Very astonishing, really. It's a strange culture. Disobedience, I think, is desperately important. We have to take on board the issue of the arms trade as that cultural, moral challenge. I mean, half what's going on in the Middle East today is we have had our finger in the arms supplies to all the countries, Tunisia, Libya, all the way around, Egypt, and now we're saying, oh dear, they're all going to shoot each other or something like that, or they're getting down to Mali by accident. I remember Dennis Healy saying, we would like a negotiated end to the arms trade, but while we're waiting, we must make sure that we secure our share of the valuable commercial market. And that's exactly what Mr. Cameron has been on about when he's on his various trips now, India and so forth, our share of the valuable. There should be an indignation about this. I think we've got to do something about our charities. Charities are very divisive. The poverty charities do not like to take on board the issue of militarism. And those who are here today, I hope that you will, if you're active in those charities, I hope you'll ask questions. War and poverty are intimately connected. If we're spending 1.7 trillion US dollars a year on war, that is money that could be spent on the real needs of humanity. And it's not being spent because there is no public challenge to the incredible military budgets. Why not? Charity legislation can be an umbrella. It can be a protective thing. You can always say the Charity Commission wouldn't allow it. Well, the Charity Commission is pretty slow on actually interfering on things. And I think we should have much more interference by the major charities about the militarization. There are lots and lots of things. Someone rang the other day, sent me a letter about war toys. What am I doing about war toys? I think, oh my God, there's something else I've got to do, is it? I began to look up war toys, and I found in America, in 2007, an excellent report from a medical group about the psychological damage done by war toys. But I couldn't find a campaign in this country interested in war toys. There it is. Anybody got a spare 10 minutes, take up war toys. I'll be glad to help you. Might even cough up some money for you. It's a major means of affecting people's minds. When I was a respectable parish priest, I remember once a little boy coming in on Christmas and saying he got a present for Jesus. And I said, oh yes, what is it? He said, a tank, and put it in the crib. So I thought, well, all right, okay, I'm very broad-minded. We're not going to interfere with Jesus' fun and games. War toys are an extremely important aspect. Reforming the United Nations, demilitarizing our monarchy. Why is it that our monarchy has to be in the army all the time doing wonderful things? Even if kill people occasionally, they're all lovely. But why don't we have a royal processions preceded by the lifeboat corps with a big boat, or some nurses from an intensive care unit, or the fire brigade? Why is it always the military? I'd love to see young Harry in the fire brigade. He'd have a lovely time, I'm sure, climbing up and down ladders and playing games with little children. It'd be great. Let's push for that a bit. They could be demilitarized because they represent an imitation model for a lot of people. And finally, Remembrance Sunday. We've got to turn around Remembrance Sunday. At the moment, it's all being hyped up. Our brave boys, our brave boys. I was on Radio Oxford the other day. Why is it that so few people are coming out when these bodies are being brought back from wherever it is, Bryce Norton or somewhere? I said, well, look, if it was a friend or I knew anything, I'd be there. I think any death is an absolute tragedy in this kind of violence. But the way the government is pushing it, I think people are torn between whether they're approving of the operation that's going on in Afghanistan or elsewhere and respecting the dead. I said I would come out for anybody who died a savage death anywhere, a traffic accident outside, I'd come out. But I said there's another tone to it going on as well. Remembrance Sunday in our little church now, we have an 11 o'clock ceremony, we have a peace garden, we've got a plaque to the people who died in the First and Second World War, but all the talk is about the best way to honour those who died in war is to work for the elimination of war. That's the best way, and that's the theme. And we have people from Palestine, we have people from Israel, we have people from Nigeria, we have others coming who are, ours a very multicultural parish, coming along, giving their stories about war. I think I've really, probably I've talked even longer than the Duke of Northumberland, but I'm not sure. I think I've now stopped. I remember the wonderful story about the American preacher, and he was asked to preach for 20 minutes, and after 20 minutes he was still in full flight, and he's still finding another text, and on he went with another text, and half an hour went, 40 minutes went by, he was still roaring away. And finally he said, throwing up his arms rhetorically, said, "My dear brethren, what more shall I say?" And the voice from the back said, "Try amen." So that's my amen, and I hope there'll be lots of interesting questions, I'm sure, because the questions are always much more interesting than the talk. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed.